Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on Zoom again. I'm very pleased to be able to present Rear Admiral Teuteberg this morning. He retired from the South African Navy in January 2013 after a career at sea and on shore spanning 4 decades. During his final appointment, he led the strategic direction process of the South African Navy and the Maritime Defence Program with the SANDF, including all aspects of the planning and budgeting processes of the South African Navy. And he's participated in many of the other policy developments of the South African Navy and the SANDF. Prior to this, Rear Admiral Teuteberg held a number of varied positions, including that of Director Maritime Plans and Director Naval Personnel, which have ensured his exposure to the full spectrum of organizational processes. He commanded the SAS Protea, the South African Navy's hydrographic survey operations platform, and more broadly within the combat component of the Navy, including command of the minesweepers SAS East London and SAS Walvis Bay. As a hydrographer of the RSA, he played a significant role in the drafting of the Maritime Zones Act of the RSA, and subsequently was extensively involved in the formulation of the SADC Maritime Security Strategy that was adopted by the relevant heads of state on the 9th of August in 2011. He has been decorated with various awards. Thank you very much, Bernhard, for the preparation and for preparing this presentation, and we're looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Robert Falconscock is one of my personal heroes, obviously with Shackleton. And the reason why Scott and Shackleton are heroes of mine is because I think we want to go out and discover things, and it takes a lot of perseverance. The sign that was up at the South Pole, it is now moved into the building, and the marker you find in front of the sign is exactly where the geographic South Pole is. However, they have to move this from time to time because the ice on which it stands obviously moves, and they have to plant a new one. I think what is important, that man cannot discover new oceans unless he has the courage to lose sight of the shore. And I think we're all part of that. I think what is important is that although in 1911, we went to the South Pole as humans, today we are no longer too worried about the Antarctic except for perhaps global warming. But today we're exploring Mars. And perhaps just to mention, the picture on the right is obviously the newest rover, Perseverance. And perhaps just to mention that earlier this week, the Ingenuity, which is a rotor helicopter, flew for the first time from the surface of Mars and subsequently conducted a second flight. Today at 1200, we will launch another Falcon 9 rocket to the International Space Station with 4 astronauts on board. But less than 120 years ago, we were still battling to get the first man to the South Pole. And these are the heroes that make up us as humans on Earth. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the Antarctic. I'm going to talk about Robert Falconscock, but specifically about what is known as the Terra Nova expedition. Now, the Terra Nova is the name of the ship which took them down to the South Pole, and Terra Nova means actually new found land. Now, Robert Falconscock was a hero after he died in the Antarctic. However, there were many people who actually said that there were many reasons for his failure to return safely to Cape Evans. Subsequently, however, there has been proof that Sir Robert Falconscock prepared himself properly, but possibly there was a lot of decisions that could have been made better. And I think we need to learn from these mistakes sometimes. The Antarctic. If you look at the little map on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see Cape Horn over here. You will see the Bransfield Strait, Gerlache Strait coming down there. You will see that Elephant Island is in that area over there. You can go down into this area where you will find primarily Argentinian bases. Our own base, the Sanai base, is in this area over here. Kerguelen Island, the French island, is over here. South Africa, obviously there. It's about 3,400 kilometers from Cape Town to get to the ice. The ice obviously moves, and you will find that the distance changes from time to time. But I think what is important is, here is the Ross Sea and the Ross Ice Shelf, and you will see that Cape Evans, from where they started, is around about here. Amundsen, the Norwegian, started towards the pole over here, and the distance between here and the South Pole is about 1,400 kilometers. The difference, obviously, between Antarctica and the North Pole is that this is a continent, whereas the North Pole, the Arctic, is purely an ice shelf and does not stand on land. What is interesting is that the average depth of the ice is about 2 kilometers. In fact, at the South Pole, it is stated that the ice is about 2,500 meters deep. So the Antarctic, still very much untouched. It holds most of the world's fresh water. I think it's important, if all the ice melted at the Antarctic, sea level would rise by about 60 meters, which means that those of you who live close to the sea probably would have to buy properties higher up the mountain. I think I may just be safe over here at the higher part of Vermont. It's actually a desert. There's very little rain, and most of the rain is in fact snow, and it's about 40 millimeters a year. It used to be a lot warmer than it is now. They reckon that at some stage it was around about 19 degrees Celsius on average. It is rapidly warming. It has been said that in the last 50 years, it has changed by about 3 degrees. Obviously, there's no Antarctic time zone. And the reason for this is because all the time zones become one at the South Pole. Everywhere from the South Pole is north. You can go nowhere else but north. There are obviously active volcanoes in the Antarctic. Deception Island is in fact a old volcano where the one side of the volcano has collapsed, and you can take a ship into the volcano because it's filled with water. What is perhaps nice to know is that on the one side of the inside of the volcano, the water is normally quite warm, around about 30 degrees Celsius. But it has been active from time to time, and the Argentinians have had to leave their base there a couple of years ago. Luckily, the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. South Africa is one of the signatories, and in fact, we are committed that Antarctic should be preserved for the future. It says basically that there should be no military use, freedom of scientific investigation, scientific free exchange, etc. No, well, at the moment, any territorial claims put on hold. Although there is some attempts from the more South American countries to put down claims, at the moment it is not recognized. The Antarctic remains, personally, for me, the most beautiful place on Earth. I want to talk about this person, Robert Falconscock. He was born in Devonport, which is today one of the main naval bases in England, in the West Coast. It houses a huge amount of ships, and there's also a submarine base. But he was born there, and his father was, in fact, a magistrate in Devonport. Devonport is, in fact, part today of Plymouth. You probably know Plymouth much better than you know Devonport. He was also a brewer. I don't know whether the brewer came first or the magistrate came first, but in fact, he fell on hard times and he could no longer really look after his family. So Robert Falconscock joined the Royal Navy in 1881. Now, in 1881, if you work out, he became a boy seaman at the age of 13 when he joined the Royal Navy. He was very ambitious, and he volunteered to lead the famous British discovery expedition to the Antarctic in 1901 to 1903. Interesting to note that Ernst Shackleton also joined this expedition, but they had a few differences of opinion, and subsequently Ernst Shackleton and Robert Falconscock never again joined forces. Shackleton did his own thing, and next week I will talk specifically about Shackleton. But although they tried half-heartedly to go to the South Pole, they didn't even get halfway. On his return, this is now Robert Falconscock, he was promoted to captain, and he received the Royal Victorian Order. He married Kathleen Bruce, who was a bit of a socialite in 1908, but he had this ambition to explore, to be an adventurer, to be the first man to do some things. And he returned to the Antarctic with the ill-fated Terra expedition in 1910-12. Scott arrived at the South Pole 5 weeks after the Norwegian Roald Amundsen had arrived there on the 18th, and therefore he was the second person actually to arrive. And part of the aim of his mission was to be the first person. So they were extremely disappointed. On the way back, he died, and it's reckoned that he died on the 29th of March, 1912. His body and the body of two others were found 8 months later in a tent about 11 miles from one of the depots. The depot was called the 1 ton depot on the way back. But I will say more about the actual expedition. The Terra Nova expedition from 1910 to 12 had a mixed aim. And as a military person, I would say that that was probably partly to blame for his failure to return safely. He wanted to study the Ross Sea area. He was also a closet scientist, and it was very important to him to study not only the fauna, the flora, oceanography, the ice, the geography, etc., but he also wanted to reach the geographic South Pole. And I personally believe that the fact that he wanted to do both, whereas Amundsen purely wanted to go to the South Pole. Everything he did was only aimed at going to the South Pole. He had no sideshows. So I think that was possibly part of the failure. The Terra Nova actually set sail from Cardiff in 1910. He had recruited a number of men, 65, to reach the South Pole and to secure for the British Empire the honor of this achievement. Now, he was going down to the South Pole whilst Roald Amundsen had said he wants to go to the North Pole. But whilst Amundsen was sailing towards the North Pole, an American by the name of Peary had arrived at the North Pole. So that specific objective had been met. he changed course and he started racing towards the south in terms of wanting to beat Scott. He advised Scott that he was turning south and that he would be going to the South Pole. And I think that changed things, where it was an expedition to go to the South Pole. This suddenly became a race between the Norwegian and Robert Falconscock in order to get to the South Pole. The ship was in fact built in Dundee for whaling and sealing in the northern part of Europe. She therefore had a bit of an ice-strengthened hull. She had sails, but she also had a compound steam engine. And if you look at it, they reckon this compound steam engine had an output of 110 kilowatt. If you look at 110 kilowatt, most cars today would have about the same power. It was bought for £12,500 by Captain Scott. And eventually, after returning to England and once again being used first as an expedition ship and later to be used once again as a whaling and sealing ship by the Norwegians, she was sunk by gunfire on the 13th of September after she was standing into danger due to a flood and a fire on board. In terms of preparations, after spending much of the time laying down advanced caches of food, because I believe he had planned properly in terms of deciding to put down depots at various intervals on the ice on the way to the South Pole that would be able to replenish his supplies. He waited out obviously the winter, was doing a lot of research, and later Amundsen wanted to start early. He tried to go in September, but was first to turn back after the temperatures dipped as low as 68 degrees. He finally left on October the 20th, and Scott left on November the 1st. I must just say that, one of the problems, or one of the things that has been said, is that Scott did not prepare properly. He had a very, very good knowledge of weather. He had an expert, he had scientists with him, and who kept records of the weather conditions on the Antarctic for numerous years. And on average, there would have been acceptable winds, acceptable temperatures on his way to the South Pole and coming back. One of the big problems, I believe, was the forms of transport. Scott tried dogs. He couldn't come right with dogs. Eventually, he decided to leave the dogs at Cape Evans. He used Siberian ponies. They didn't work. They couldn't adapt to the cold. It was too cold for them. And most of them were shot, in fact, and eaten. And he even used a few motorized tractors. Now, the motorized tractors got about 11 miles from Cape Evans before they finally packed up. Today, of course, it's all helicopters. There's a runway at the South Pole where they land a large aircraft to replenish the people who live there. Today, it's a different story altogether. Amundsen, he in fact knew how to use dogs. He had practiced with dogs. He had lots of experience with dogs, and he knew how to walk with snowshoes. He had a lot more experience in dealing with snow and ice than our friend Scott. If you look at Amundsen in the left top picture, and you see the dogs on the right-hand side on board the ship, and you read what Lord Curzon said at the British Royal Geographic Society dinner in London, and he said, "I almost wish that in our tribute of admiration, we could include those wonderful, good-tempered, fascinating dogs, the true friends of man, without whom Captain Amundsen would never have got to the pole. I therefore propose 3 cheers for the dogs. And I still cheer my dogs for protecting me here in Vermont. Setting up camp at Cape Evans, this is a photograph of Scott in his own private little cabin. He was the only one to have a little cabin. By the way, the hut you see there was built by them. It was subsequently refurbished or renovated, and it's kept in the original state by future generations. You can see here the scientists doing their experiments during the Antarctic winter. Certainly they wanted to do a lot of research whilst down there. Left top, you can see the tractor, which I spoke about, that could only ride for about 11 miles. You can see the Siberian pony left. You can see Amundsen and his dogs, the right hand. And you can see at the top, right hand, the way that Scott tried to get to the South Pole by using themselves to drag the sleigh with provisions with them. This is what it looked like. There was no way that they could return. They even had a huge number of rock samples on the sleigh they wanted to bring back from the South Pole. Scott employed several teams, 28 men in total, and they used all these sledges, ponies, dogs to push to the pole. He selected Wilson, Oates, Bowers, Evans to join him. And I think one of the issues, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that they had prepared for 4 people to eventually make the final push towards the pole. But then he decided to add a 5th person. Now, the 5th person, they didn't have enough provisions for the 5th person, so they all had to share. They didn't have skis for him, so he had to walk with his boots. And I think that slowed him down considerably. He arrived at the pole and he saw the Norwegian flag and he said, "Great God, this is an awful place and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." He was very unhappy. In fact, his whole expedition were happy, and they then made their way back towards Cape Evans. Evans died on the February the 17th, suffering from injuries after falls. He was severely frostbitten and convinced he was slowing his companions down. But that was also why Oates certainly was severely hampered by his injuries, frostbite, etc. And he made the ultimate sacrifice. One day he walked out of his tent. He actually said to them, "I'm going outside. I may be out for a long time." So he intended not coming back. A couple of days later, they set a final camp just 11 miles shy of what was known as the 1-ton depot. They were stopped by a huge storm. The temperatures were extremely low, much lower than it was at the pole. I think at the pole they experienced temperatures of about minus 29 degrees Celsius, whilst at that time it was about minus 45 degrees. The wind was blowing, the storm was carrying. They were living in a tent for 2 weeks whilst the storms carried on. And this was not predicted. Later on, the bodies of Wilson, Bowers, and Scott were found on the 12th of November of that year. They'd all written their farewell letters. They knew this was the end. Historians, as I've said before, began to question Scott's overbearing leadership style and many of his tactical decisions. However, there is proof that he in fact prepared properly. Some of his decisions, perhaps he was forced into them by the fact that this had become a race. This is the routes taken to the South Pole. You can see here Evans, who succumbed to his injuries, and Oates, who walked out into the blizzard, and then Scott and Wilson died around about here, either the 29th or the 30th of March 1912. They were, as I said, about 11 miles from One Ton Depot. That's a photo that was taken, British flag, on the 16th of January 1912, and they arrived here. And this is obviously Amundsen, who arrived at the South Pole 5 weeks before. If you look at the reasons for the failure, then primarily people are reporting that the weather on the return journey was much, much worse than was predicted. Obviously, transportation choices, I've spoke about the vehicles, the horses, the dogs, etc. There's also a question about possibility of misunderstood orders. What I mean by that is that whilst he had left over here and there's One Ton Depot, Mid-Barrier Depot, there were depots placed, and there's some argument that the One Ton Depot was not put in the correct place, but should have been further south. I have not found proof of this, but this is being used as an argument. Obviously, the role of Amundsen, the fact that he had arrived at the South Pole before, changed the complexion of the attitude that I think a certain amount of depression set in, that they were not the first people to arrive at the South Pole. The fact that this became a race, remembering that Amundsen's only purpose was to get to the South Pole. He had no interest in science. He had no interest in other observations. He just wanted to get there, and he got there first because that was what he did. Amundsen walked about 5 hours a day. They walked about 10. So with lack of food, because of the fact that they were now 5 instead of 4, they couldn't get the right amount of calories to support them pulling their own sleigh all the way back to Cape Evans. The size of the polar party, I've spoken about the fact that there were 5 instead of 4. They also had leaking fuel cans. Now, we all, I think at our age, we all understand primer stoves and the fact that they require fuel, but they had leaking fuel cans. And the problem is that if you don't have fuel, you can't make water. They used snow. And with lack of fuel, there was a problem. Their diet, if you go into the expedition, you find that they may have shown early symptoms of scurvy due to lack of a good diet. And then obviously the slow effects of insufficient food. Robert Falconscock, as a scientist, kept a very good diary. And the diary today contains much information. The last thing he basically wrote in this diary said, "We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint. But bowed to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of each and every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies tell the tale, but surely, surely, a great rich country like ours will see that those who are dependent on us are properly provided for." In conclusion, it's life that matters, nothing but life. The process of discovering, the everlasting and perpetual process, not the discovery itself at all. It's about us as humans and our own battles and our own discoveries and our own roads that we journey on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernhard. It's always fascinated me to listen to this story and read about this story. So much courage, and yet at the end, an unfortunate end. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, time for questions. Anybody?
I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you very, very much for all this enlightening detail of one of my personal heroes as well. Great pity that things went against him and his team. But thank you for this very sensitive discussion of the expedition and the outcome of it. Thank you, Bernhard. That was fascinating.
Letitia, an absolute pleasure. I really enjoy. Unfortunately, there's so much information available. There's that you need to try and sift through all the information that's available. It's incredible what has been achieved in the last 20 years in our lives in terms of not only technologies, but the information that's being made available to us as human beings.
Can I ask you, the depots that were placed along the route, who provided those? Was it done by his own people before he left, or how were they deposited?
Yeah, it was definitely his own people. Before he set off, some of the depots were placed, but he started off from Cape Evans with a party of 28 people, men, and they would drop off supplies at certain points with only the last, I don't know how many kilometers, but the last, let's say 25% or 30% of the voyage being conducted by the 5 people. So in fact, 23 people turned back, and as they went, they established these depots.
And what was the motivation for adding the 5th person that was not fully equipped to the expedition? I mean, that was seems to be like a very unwise decision.
I think it was an unwise, but this was a scientist. And that's why I said right at the beginning, I really believe, having really tried to get into the details of this expedition, that in fact, Scott cared deeply for, first of all, his men. Secondly, he cared for the mission, and the mission being firstly a scientific mission, and secondly to reach the South Pole. So he in the end decided to add a scientist to the final party in order to be able to record for future generations any scientific findings. I think that was the actual reason for that.
Bernhard, could I also ask you, how long before they realized that he and his party had died? How long did that take? Because you say the bodies were discovered in November, that's nearly a year later. How long did it take for the news to get through?
What happened was that obviously they had not arrived at Cape Evans, and small search parties were sent out from Cape Evans. They did not get beyond 1 ton depot. And then obviously winter set in. And it's only after winter, 8 months after Scott had died, that they managed to find him and his 2 friends in a tent. They subsequently built a snow hut around the tent, and they used 2 skis to put a cross on top of this igloo that they built for these 3 bodies that were left behind. So it took them 8 months, but remembering that there was a winter in between. The news of them not returning eventually got to Melbourne when the ship returned to Australia, being the shortest route.
What happened to the Norwegian? Did he live happily ever after?
He went back to Norway as a hero, obviously, and he subsequently died when he went onto a rescue mission on the Arctic. I don't know exactly how long after he made the South Pole, but a number of years later, he died on the Arctic.
I just wanted to thank Bernhard for a very moving presentation of the tremendous courage and bravery of these men. And I seem to recall vaguely that there had been a film made of the story years ago Is that available? Do you know at all about that, Bernhard?
I'm not 100% sure about a movie. What I can tell you is if you go to YouTube and you put in Robert Falconscock, the number of documentaries are endless. There's so much information available, and I really think in depth. But what you will notice is that most of the videos that are available either take the one side that he was not a hero, or the other side that he was a hero. So you cannot watch only one video, you have to watch more videos, but they're all on YouTube, in fact.
There's a question from David Pike. Do we know what the actual scientific benefits were of this expedition?
Remember that it's only in 1889 that the first person set foot on the Antarctic. So at the time, we knew very, very little about the Antarctic. We didn't know about the animals. We didn't know about the weather. There were surveys being done. One of the things that I asked myself was, how the hell did they get to the South Pole? How did they know where the South Pole was? And how did they navigate? And in fact, star sites were the thing that got them there. So there was a lot of geography involved. There was a lot of knowledge gained on the penguins, the seals. In 1889, we knew nothing about the Antarctic. Whether there were specific discoveries, I don't know.
Bernhard, thank you very much. Most impressed. A question, is there a memorial to Scott in Cape Town?
Can I answer that? There is a memorial to Robin Falconscock at the lower end of Adderley Street at the top of the Herengracht. I had heard that it had been vandalized, so I'm not sure if it's still there, but there certainly was one near the big roundabout with a water fountain. I also have a question. In TV things I've seen on the Scott expedition, one of the factors that was suggested as a reason why Amundsen had another advantage over Scott was that the route he took on the Antarctic was actually less physically challenging. Is that the case?
I haven't measured it, but I know I've read somewhere that the route he took was 60 miles shorter. Whether it was less taxing, I really can't say. I know it was shorter though.
Thank you, Bernhard. I would like to thank you very much for this lecture. I spent a year at the Sinai base, primarily as the doctor, but my tasks included being the dog master. I ran 2 sledges with 25 huskies, and we spent months in the field re-equipping depots and transporting the scientists who were doing all sorts of observations, the geologists. So I have sympathy with Scott and the conditions. We spent weeks in a tent waiting for storms to pass. One observation though, we found that during these violent storms, the temperatures actually rose from on quiet days it was down to -40, -50 degrees centigrade. But during a storm, excluding the wind factor inside the tent, it went up to about 20, 22 degrees. So if you stayed in your tent, you were relatively safe. But thanks very much. I enjoyed this very much.
Louis, that's a great input. Thank you very much. I remember a long time ago, my father used to be with the Department of Physics in Stellenbosch University, and they had prepared a lot of instrumentation to go down to the Antarctic with the old RSA. And I accompanied my father when they took some of this equipment to the old RSA, and it just fascinated me so much that humans could go down to the ice, stay in in that environment for a year. I knew a guy called Ulrich Schulz who stayed down there for a year, and I spoke to him extensively about the hardships that people who actually went down there and stayed down there that they had to endure.
By the way, you know, RSA stands for Rolling Slightly Awash. It was a terrible journey. Captain McNish was the captain with Herr Funk. This year we celebrate 50 years of overwintering at Sinai. It was 1971.
Fantastic.
Bernhard, first of all, the fact that Amundsen's journey was so much shorter, since both of them were treading onto virginal soil, was that luck? How could it have been calculated? And it's always puzzled me, how do you know in those days, if you were the first to get there, how do you know you've reached the South Pole?
You planted your flag. I said that I was so impressed with their navigational skills that in fact Amundsen reached the pole and he left a tent, and on top of the tent was this flag, the Norwegian flag, and inside were certain provisions that he left with a note for Scott saying that they had arrived on this date, etc. And if they needed or wanted any of the provisions or goods that are left behind in the tent, they were very welcome to use this. So how did they know? Through pure navigation. I suspect that Admiral Johan Retief would probably be able to give a more scientific answer than that.
In those days, they used a thing called a zenith instrument that they calculated latitude with at various places. It was used extensively in South Africa for the measuring of the arc of the meridian. And but the same instrument could be used in the Arctic. You don't require an horizon to measure the angle of. You use a plumb line to set up the instrument, and then you take a specific star and you measure its distance from the zenith. And if you know what the star is and what its latitude is or its declination, you can easily calculate your latitude. And I presume they just calculated the latitude of 90 and say, we are here, and they planted a flag.
Here's a comment by David Pike. There was an old black and white British film called Scott of the Antarctic, made about 65 years ago. Bernhard, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation and for the interesting discussion afterwards. Thank you for your preparation, and we're certainly looking forward to your next one next week.